Hey, what's up guys? I hope you're doing well. In today's video, we will be analyzing from a biological point of view the events of The Bay, a body horror film with a heavy ecological aspect to it that stands out due to its quite original premise, a plague of flesh-eating parasites mutated by the effects of chicken crap. This might sound a little silly, but in this video we're going to examine how it actually does make some sense. We will also see what kind of organisms these parasites are, we will try to give them a realistic explanation from a scientific point of view, and then we'll place them on the danger scale we use in this channel. But first, as usual, let's get some context. The events of The Bay take place in a small coastal town called Claridge, located on the Chesapeake Bay on the east coast of the United States. It is a picturesque place with calm and seemingly safe beaches that support the area's tourism and fishing activities. Also, this town has a growing poultry industry, enormous chicken farms supported by a desalination plant that provides water to both birds and the town's residents. All of this sounds pretty idyllic until the 4th of July 2009, when in the middle of the holiday festivities a series of nightmarish events began to unfold. On one hand, several people are found dead with clear signs of what appears to be violence, horrible wounds including tongue amputations and even the appearance of having been partially eaten. On the other hand, in just a matter of hours, around 60 people are admitted to the local emergency room with grotesque lesions that progress rapidly, ulcers, vesicles and painful blisters that give way to extensive necrosis of the skin and underlying tissues that can even require limb amputations, all of which is accompanied by vomiting and an altered state of consciousness. At first, these seem to be unrelated events, episodes of violence on one side and an infectious disease on the other. Initially, the medical authorities, including the most incompetent version of the Center for Disease Control I've ever seen, proposed several potential pathogens to explain this outbreak. They suggest everything from non-existent things like fungal bacteria to relatively plausible explanations such as a Vibrio vulnificus outbreak. This is a species of bacterium that lives in brackish waters such as those that surround this town. It is a pathogen that is transmitted through seafood and other sea products widely consumed in the area, but also through direct contact between an open wound and water. This bacterium causes a rapidly progressive necrosis of soft tissues and can lead to death in as little as 24 hours. It can also cause symptoms similar to food poisoning, all of which fits quite well with what we can see among the victims. The CDC also proposes a possible outbreak of Staphylococcus aureus, a common bacterium that usually lives in the human body, which, under certain circumstances, can also cause fast-spreading skin infections and episodes of food poisoning. Given these bacterial suspects, the medical staff recommends that the victims should be treated with methicillin, an antibiotic that, in reality, is not used in medical practice due to its high rate of adverse effects. There is also the fact that several strains of Staphylococcus aureus are famously resistant to it. Fortunately, and despite the help from the CDC, it is eventually determined that the cause of the outbreak isn't viral or bacterial in nature, but instead it is caused by parasites. Both the apparent scenes of violence and the large number of sick people are actually due to a flesh-eating parasite that causes various signs and symptoms as it grows inside its victims, ultimately mutilating and eating them from the inside once it reaches adulthood. The parasite in question is a highly mutated variant of a crustacean called CYMOTHOA exigua, which exists in real life and belongs to the isopod order. It is the same type of crustaceans that includes pillbugs. CYMOTHOA exigua is a fairly widespread parasitic organism that can be found along much of the American coastline. Fortunately, this crustacean in its natural state does not affect humans, but instead feeds on the blood of fish. It usually attaches itself to the fish's tongue, taking over the blood flow to this organ, which eventually undergoes atrophy and even necrosis, being completely replaced by the parasite itself. In the case of the isopods we see in this movie, they have undergone a series of changes in their physiology and life cycle, which allows them not only to grow and reproduce incredibly fast, reaching maturity in just a matter of hours, but most importantly to affect human beings. These parasites are transmitted in the form of eggs that enter the body when contaminated water from the bay where they develop is accidentally or deliberately ingested. I don't just mean drinking bay water directly, which can happen during swimming, but also possibly the consumption of water coming from the desalination plant, which apparently has quality standards about as high as this movie's version of the Center for Disease Control. The eggs end up lodging in the digestive system of their hosts, where the larvae develop, feeding on the mucosa and probably even the blood flow of the intestines, something that would explain the vomiting caused by the irritation and the internal damage to the digestive tract. The larvae reach adulthood in a matter of hours, and at that point they begin to eat their victims from the inside as they search for a way out. Perhaps due to instinct or because of its connection to the digestive system, the parasites usually choose to eat their victim's tongue, much like what happens with real-life CYMOTHOA exigua. Depending on the organs affected, death could be relatively quick and painless. For example, if the parasites damage one of the large vessels in the thorax, the heart, or one of the major blood vessels in the abdominal cavity or neck. But on the contrary, death could also be a slow and painful process if the parasites avoid vital structures. In any case, the intestinal perforation inevitably caused by the isopods in their way out would lead to the spread of the bacteria contained in the fecal matter throughout the abdominal cavity, causing what is known as an infectious peritonitis, and from there to a septic shock. This is a potentially slow and definitely painful process. However, there are a couple of signs and symptoms that don't quite match this explanation, particularly the appearance of blisters, vesicles, and even necrosis in soft tissues. These appear not only before the larvae have reached adulthood, but also in ways that don't quite align with the direct damage caused by the parasite. A parasite that eats the flesh of its victims should not, in principle, cause blisters, much less necrosis. But to explain these apparently inconsistent symptoms, we can turn to several hypotheses. The first would be what is known as a type 1 hypersensitivity reaction, and to understand what this means, we have to keep in mind that throughout our bodies, including the skin, we have various populations of cells that are constantly on guard to protect us from parasitic threats. I'm talking specifically about eosinophiles and mast cells, which contain highly reactive and irritating substances designed to pierce and damage the body of the parasitic agents that commonly attack humans. These cells react when exposed to a particular type of antibody, immunoglobulin E or IgE, which our body produces upon detecting the presence of a parasite. Having parasites, particularly multicellular ones like worms or in this case isopods, increases the circulating levels of immunoglobulin E throughout our bodies. And in response to this, eosinophiles release their reactive substances, causing the appearance of lesions, even skin lesions, despite the parasite being located, for example, in the digestive system. A parasitic infection, even if localized, can have and usually have systemic manifestations. Perhaps the best real-life example of this is what is known as Loeffler's syndrome, caused by the presence of various intestinal parasites in the human body. Loeffler syndrome presents, among other manifestations, with skin rashes as well as dry cough, fever, and fatigue. The second hypothesis we have to explain the early appearance of skin lesions in affected individuals is what is known as cross-reactions or cross-reactivity. In these cases, our immune system creates antibodies to fight a given threat that accidentally are also capable of damaging our own tissues. Keep in mind that antibodies recognize molecular sequences in pathogens in order to attack them. If any of these molecular sequences happens to be sufficiently similar to those found in our own body, a cross-reaction can occur, in which the antibody ends up attacking both the pathogen and our cells. This is the basis for several important diseases like rheumatic fever, for example, but more important in this case, some blistering diseases such as the different types of pemphigus. In this group of disorders, our own antibodies attack the skin, causing it to lose cohesion, leading to the formation of large blisters and even bullae, which is a medical term for extra large blisters. Particularly relevant in this case would be endemic pemphigus foliaceus, which is associated with exposure to insect bites, and insects and crustaceans are actually almost the same thing. Finally, the third hypothesis, and probably the best, to explain the skin lesions and necrosis is that these parasites are carriers of bacteria and even viruses capable of causing additional damage. This is nothing unusual, and in fact there are several examples of this in nature. Among the parasites that affect humans we have Onchocerca volvulus, a nematode, a form of worm that causes a disease known as river blindness. This parasite is known for carrying a symbiotic bacterium of the Wolbachia genus, which significantly worsens the damage caused by the parasite. Another similar example would be Leishmania brasiliensis, the parasite that causes mucocutaneous leishmaniasis. This parasite carries a virus, aptly named Leishmania virus, which is indirectly responsible for the horrible and disfiguring lesions caused by this disease. So, taking into account that the isopods seen in this film developed and mutated in a highly contaminated environment, as we'll see shortly, it is quite probable that they are carriers of dangerous pathogens, most likely including the previously mentioned Vibrio vulnificus, which would actually be a solid explanation for the lesions we observe. In fact, some dialogues point directly to this. Another symptom we would need to clarify is the altered state of consciousness and disorganized behavior we can see in some of the victims, but actually this has an easy explanation. Confusion is a rather common symptom in diseases that trigger an intense inflammatory response. For example, when assessing how severe a patient's pneumonia is, a scale, or rather a score known as Curve 65, is used. This name is really an acronym for confusion, urea, respiratory rate, blood pressure, and age over 65 years. As you can see, confusion is the first criterion of this score, as this is a symptom that tends to worsen with the severity of pneumonia. And it is also something that can be expected in the presence of intense immune activity or severe infections. The blood loss and the pain caused by the parasites very likely also contributes significantly to the victim's altered state of mind. Now, with that said, we have to talk about the origin of these parasitic isopods, perhaps the most bizarre yet original aspect of this film. Instead of involving government experiments or lab-engineered mutagenic viruses, these parasites originated from exposure to a bit of radiation and, above all, massive quantities of hormone-laden chicken crap. Even though this might sound a bit extravagant, it is actually a reasonably plausible explanation. First, we have to say that the use of hormones in poultry farming is a practice that has fallen both out of favor and legality, but it was relatively common in the past and was present illegally in the farms of Claridge. Two compounds were particularly used in this practice, the ethylstilbestrol and exestrol. These substances are classified as non-steroid estrogens. This means that they are not anabolic hormones, at least not in humans. They are not related to testosterone. Rather, they act as estradiol, which is the main feminizing hormone in the human body. The purpose of giving estrogens to chickens is not only because estrogens do have an anabolic effect in these birds, but also to prevent that male chickens turn into roosters. But I digress. What is really important and what we have to remember is the fact that these synthetic hormones behave like steroid hormones. Now, this type of hormones, steroid hormones, are not exclusive to humans and chickens and are actually present even in arthropods, specifically in the form of ecdysteroids that are used by these kind of animals to regulate certain aspects of their physiology, primarily the molting and metamorphosis processes necessary for their development and growth. With the help of the relatively high levels of radiation in the bay water, certain mutations, and natural selection pressures, the native isopods of the bay could have developed sensitivity to the hormones found in the chicken feces dumped into the water, taking advantage of those hormones to accelerate their development and growth. And if we consider that, as we mentioned before, these animals already have their own steroid hormone systems, then it is really not all that far-fetched. Especially when we take into account that the hormones that were used in poultry farming tend to leave the chickens' bodies precisely through feces and urine, which were being illegally dumped into the water. Here is where the peculiar anatomy of birds may have also played a role. Unlike humans, birds don't have a urinary bladder but instead a structure called a cloaca, where waste from both the digestive and urinary systems is combined. They don't go number one or number two, but rather a combination of both. Let's call it the 1.5. These semi-liquid droppings, known as excreta, would therefore contain the full amount of hormones eliminated from the chicken's bodies, which ended in the vase water. Now, there's a problem with all of this, and it is that regardless of the amount of steroids in the chicken's droppings, it still would have been diluted in a huge amount of water. However, we must also take into account an ecological process known as biomagnification, the progressive accumulation of substances as we go up in the food chain. Small crustaceans would feed on the hormonated chicken crab, concentrating these compounds in their bodies. Then those small crustaceans would be eaten by fish, which would concentrate the hormones even more, and those fish in turn would be eaten by larger fish, building up increasingly higher doses of these hormones. The isopods, by feeding on the blood of fish loaded with steroids or analogs of steroids, would inevitably be exposed to these hormones, which would make them grow larger and faster, interfering with their natural ecdysteroids. This biomagnification process, along with algal and bacterial bloom, would explain the significant die-off of bird and fish that occurred around the bay during the events of the film. And that is how we end up with a new species of parasitic isopod that grows and reproduces extremely fast, with an appetite to match, and that also carry infectious agents due to having developed in a literal cesspool of colossal proportions. Living or working near the sea, if a species like this were to spread across the planet, would become a major risk that could affect the global economy, but I don't think we're looking at a truly serious threat in this case. The fact of the matter is that these parasites depend on the abnormally high levels of hormones in the bay for their development, and without their chicken crab supplements, it is likely that this species would revert to its normal state, or perhaps even they would die off due to lacking a normal and functional endocrine system. For that reason, the most appropriate score for this threat would be a 4 out of 10, temporary local disruption. In the next video, we will analyze another completely different kind of threat that also uses poop to get the job done, the freakers from Days Gone. Subscribe if you don't want to miss that. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to feed the algorithm with a comment. That's all from me now, and I'll see you all in the next video.